Working as a domestic servant for a wealthy family in the 17th century would have been tough. Long hours, hard work, and while you usually had a roof over your head, the pay wasn't great. What if your master was known to be a violent man, quick to temper, leaving you fearing for your life if you got on the wrong side of him? That seems to be the reality of the household staff of Aston Hall in Birmingham during the time of its first owner, Sir Thomas Holte. While outwardly a very accomplished and ambitious man, eager for his family to climb the ranks of social standing, there are stories about him which show an altogether darker side. Rumours of murder, imprisonment, and even suicide among those who shared a home with him have been whispered about in the centuries since. And if the stories are to be believed, a lot of the paranormal activity witnessed at Aston Hall today is thanks to this one man's alleged actions in life. First things first, I need to let you know we're talking about Aston Hall, the Birmingham one, not Aston Hall Mental Hospital in Derbyshire, which was its own house of horrors where a doctor used to torture his patients, or Aston Hall Hotel, which has also been a mental hospital back in the day and is also rumoured to be haunted. Seems to be a popular name, but this particular Aston Hall was first dreamt up when a guy called Sir Thomas Holte came onto the scene. And Thomas, he was from a reasonably well-to-do family, but this guy had big ambitions. He knew he was meant for bigger things. He was born in 1571 and studied law at Magdalen College in Oxford before going on to join the Inner Temple, which is one of the 4 Inns of Court. Basically a professional association to which barristers have to belong to so that they can be called to the bar and practice. Thomas eventually became High Sheriff of Warwickshire in 1599 and went on to be knighted by King James I on the 18th of April 1603. So already, I mean, you can see how well the guy was doing for himself. In 1611, King James needed to raise some cash for the plantation of Ulster. Basically, he wanted to plant some of his subjects there who were loyal to the crown, just to try and reduce the threat of a rebellion in Ireland. And so for the sum of just over £1,000, about 250 grand in today's money, you could buy yourself this title of baronet. Thomas Holte was well up for it, and on the 25th of November 1611 became the first Holtes baronet. Baronets were entitled to add a red left hand to their family crests to symbolise their rank as baronet, and also to show that the title had originated from the colonisation of Ulster. And so, because obviously you've just paid all of this money for the title of baronet, you're going to make sure everyone knows it, right? And so, Sir Thomas Holte added the red hand of Ulster to the family coat of arms. But there was one slight issue in Sir Thomas's case specifically, because he was apparently known as this violent, quick-tempered man who'd start an argument with you over the smallest thing. His haters basically started rumours saying that the red hand had a different meaning, saying that it was actually symbolising something from Sir Thomas's past that he had gotten away with: murder. And we're not just talking like a gentlemanly duel settling a disagreement in the 17th century or anything like that. This story is absolutely brutal. So the story goes that Sir Thomas was out hunting with a few of his mates, and one of the guys bet him that if they turned back right now and arrived back at Davidson Hall, where the Holtes lived, unexpectedly, the cook wouldn't be ready for them. I guess that was kind of the thing at the time, wasn't it? You needed to be ready for any eventuality. If the master of the house came home early, he'd still expect the table to be set. It sounds like maybe the guy making the bet was just hungry and wanted to cut the hunting trip short ready for lunch. But Sir Thomas, he took his mate up on that bet. For his violent temper and general not niceness, he had absolute faith in the cook. He'd never let him down before, and he trusted that he would be ready. So back they rode to Davidson Hall, strode into the dining room, and there was the table, bare, not a morsel of food ready for them. The cook had been caught short, and Sir Thomas's mates all had a right old giggle at his expense. And so then came the violent temper. Sir Thomas was said to be absolutely mortified that he had lost the bet. So when he entered the kitchen, he is said to have grabbed the nearest sharp implement, which happened to be a meat cleaver, which he then proceeded to use to strike the cook. And this is going to get a bit brutal, but he split his head in two, with either side of this poor man's head falling to rest on his shoulders. That's the story, anyway. And it was a story that, in 1606, a guy called William Ascrick was going about telling people. Obviously, that is absolutely not a good look for Sir Thomas, someone going around saying that you killed a cook with a meat cleaver. So he sued this William for slander. And he did win. But then William appealed, which he then won, with the court ruling that it couldn't have been slander because we don't actually know for sure that a cook was even killed, let alone had his head cleft in twain. So So William Asquith didn't have to pay any damages to Sir Thomas, but at no point did Thomas actually deny that he had done these things. And it also doesn't look like anyone really looked into whether the cook was actually still alive or not. Either way, it wouldn't matter, as he eventually secured a royal pardon a few years after that. So even if he did do it, which we don't know he did, it was all allegedly, I'm not getting slapped with a slander lawsuit, he wouldn't be able to be charged for it. And so, with knowing about the lawsuit and the appeal that happened in 1606, and then the red hand being added to the family crest in 1611, Sir Thomas wasn't going to shake these rumours about what he may have done to the cook anytime soon. But he was absolutely not going to let some silly little rumours about a brutal murder he may or may not have committed get in the way of his lofty ambitions. He was a big deal now, bigger than all of the other families in the area, and he needed a house to reflect that. His childhood home, Aston Hall, just wasn't going to cut it. And so in 1618, work began on building Sir Thomas Holte the stately home of his dreams, Aston Hall. Construction took a good few years, being finally finished in 1635, 17 years later, but Sir Thomas actually moved in 1631 while construction was still going on. I can absolutely imagine that though, like knowing what I do of what his character was supposed to be, he'd bloody well had enough of waiting around. I'm moving in now, you can carry on constructing all around me. But once it was finished, it was every bit the home of a well-to-do family. There were also rumours that there were secret tunnels underneath the house leading to the parish church of St. Peter and St. Paul across the road, but of course they've long since been bricked up. But Aston Hall would see quite a lot of drama during the English Civil War, where Charles I effectively declared war on Parliament, which turned into this nationwide conflict on how the country should be run. Sir Thomas Holte, he was a fierce loyalist and actually hosted King Charles I on the 16th and 17th of October 1642, as he was on his way back down to London, a journey which would result in the Battle of Edge Hill a few days afterwards on the 23rd of October, being pretty much the first major battle of the Civil War. So Sir Thomas Holte's son, Edward, he was actually injured in this battle, but he went on to recover from it. But the fighting would get an awful lot closer to home for Sir Thomas when in December 1643 it was besieged by 1,200 parliamentarian troops. Sir Thomas had already had an inkling about what was to happen, and so he'd been provided with 40 musketeers from the nearby Dudley Castle. But 40 odd versus 1,200, yeah, it went about as well as you could expect. Aston Hall suffered some really bad damage as the parliamentarians shot cannonballs into the house, and it was just a manor. It wasn't like some of the more fortified buildings we've spoken about before. After a few days, the royalists surrendered, having lost 12 men, but they'd taken 60 parliamentarians down with them. The now damaged Aston Hall was taken over by parliamentarians, and Sir Thomas Holte was imprisoned, although not really for that long. In February 1644, so a couple of months later, he was released and given back Aston Hall, although he did have a hefty fine to pay of almost £4,500, about 900 grand in today's money. Even so, he carried on living in his home until his death on the 14th of December 1654. And Sir Thomas Holte, in his life, he had been married twice, had a bunch of kids, 15 of them, but only one actually outlived him, his daughter Grace, with a lot of them not making it through childhood. But there was a lot of drama surrounding one particular son, Edward, the same guy who had gone to fight in the Battle of Edge Hill and got wounded. And I feel like this really kind of sums up Sir Thomas, at least the vindictive side of him. So with all of his influence, rubbing shoulders with the king, Sir Thomas had secured Edward a place working for King Charles I. So obviously that meant he needed to move down to London. And while he was there, Edward met and fell in love with a woman called Elizabeth King, the daughter of the Bishop of London at the time, John King. And Sir Thomas was not super happy about it. He did not give this match his blessing. He thought Edward could do better. And by that I mean marry higher up, to better the Holte family name. Edward ignored his dad and went on to marry Elizabeth anyway, and so Sir Thomas was furious. He cut Edward out of his will completely, and he got to the point where the king himself actually got involved and was a bit like, come on mate, it isn't really that bad of a match. But Sir Thomas held firm. Edward would unfortunately go on to die of a fever he caught in the Civil War in Oxford in 1643 anyway. But it seems even after his son died, Sir Thomas did not ever warm to the guy again. During his final days though, he was eventually convinced to leave Aston Hall, his other estates, and the title of baronet to Edward's son, Robert Holte. So there is that. And I know I've painted quite a picture about the sort of man that Sir Thomas supposedly was, but in the interests of giving you all the information I could find so that you can form your own opinions, he did leave money in his will for the poor, and the Holte almshouses were built to house poor tenants. So, you know, there is that too. But once Sir Robert Holte, Thomas's grandson, man had been given Aston Hall, he set about bringing the place back to life. He finally repaired the damage that Aston Hall had sustained during the Civil War, although he left one cannonball hole in the staircase. Just as a reminder, a bit like a kind of look what happened here, look, we were loyal to the king during the Civil War. And from then on, Aston Hall stayed as the Holte family seat up until the 19th century. As in 1817, the current owner of the house, Abraham Bracebridge of Aston Hall, who had married into the Holte family, he ran into a spot of financial trouble, shall we say? And I mean, that is putting it quite lightly. Abraham had been a part owner of a soap and alkali manufacturing company, but I don't think he was very good at running things. Between him and his business partner, they seemingly ran the company into the ground and put the business into liquidation, owing debts in today's money of millions. One of the creditors was owed £24,000, equating to about 1.4 million in today's money. And so to clear those debts, Aston Hall, Abraham's wife's inherited family estate, had to go. Aston Hall was then bought and leased out to James Watt Jr., the son of the engineer James Watt, the guy responsible for inventing a bunch of things, including the Watt steam engine. And James Watt Jr. lived at Aston Hall until his death on the 2nd of June 1848, which would be the end of the building being used as a home. By this point in time, we're fully into the Industrial Revolution. Birmingham as a city has grown massively, and so a lot of the parkland which made up the estate of Aston Hall had been taken away bit by bit and built on. And so some thought that it was really only a matter of time before this huge grand house would be torn down in the name of progress, but locals weren't having it. In 1858, Aston Hall was bought by the Aston Hall and Park Company Limited, and it was turned into this leisure park, opened on the 16th of June by Queen Victoria on her first visit to Birmingham as Queen. But they did have a bunch of difficulties with it. There was rioting in 1861, and then tragically in 1863, a circus performer died when she fell from the high wire while she was performing. The year after that, the Aston Hall and Park Company Limited was dissolved, and the estate was sold to the Birmingham Corporation, basically the local council. They then continued making improvements to the park. They added boating lakes, a roller skating rink. They even had a menagerie at one point with elephants, tigers, lions, bears, all sorts. And of course, a football pitch that would eventually become the home of Aston Villa Football Club in 1897, with them buying the whole area and creating Villa Park in 1911. And so that's why they have a stand called the Holte End, after Sir Thomas Holte. But Aston Hall itself, it's still open to the public today on select days, I think, but you can have a walk around, experience what it would be like living there as a member of the Holte family, even see the cannonball damage left on the staircase, and of course, potentially catch a glimpse of something a bit more paranormal. Because there are multiple stories of ghosts at Aston Hall, perhaps unsurprising to absolutely no one. I came across a few sources saying that Sir Thomas Holte himself haunted Aston Hall, but there were no specific witness accounts or stories or anything. So while it does make sense that the guy who built the place is still hanging around getting maximum return on his investment, I'm not 100% sure on that one. And one I'm even less sure about is the ghost of the cook, whose head was cleft in twain. Sorry, I just love saying that. It always reminds me of Mary from Ghosts.
But how are they cleft in twain?
Anyway, I came across a few sources which claimed that the ghost of the cook was hanging around Aston Hall, particularly the kitchens, perhaps to torment Sir Thomas for what he did to him. But the thing is, if this did actually happen, it happened at Davidson Hall. Aston Hall wasn't even built at that point. But also, we don't know if it even happened at all. But that is not the only story of a ghostly servant who's allegedly still wandering around this old house. Up in the attic, the servants' quarters, the apparition of a servant boy called Dick has been seen, which has given the area the name Dick's Garret. He's either seen wandering around that area, or if you're really unlucky, like a caretaker once was, you might see him hanging from the rafters, which is apparently how he came to his tragic end. The story goes that he was working at the house during the time of Sir Thomas Holte, and he'd stolen just a scrap of bread. He's hungry, it's hard work, you can hardly blame him. But end of the day, what he did was wrong, and he'd been caught and sent up to the servants' quarters to await punishment from the master of the house. If it all really did shake out how it's described, I'm sure this poor boy knew of the reputation Sir Thomas had, knew what he may or may not have done to the cook all those years ago, and so he very well was probably terrified about what was going to happen to him. And so, because of that, he took his own life. However, we don't know who this serving boy is. We don't have dates to check whether he actually was working here during the time of Sir Thomas. We don't even know if this definitely happened. It is interesting though that older books state that the actual reason this servant boy had been awaiting punishment was not because of stealing, but because he had fallen in love with a woman of a much higher station than him. Is it just me who finds it so interesting how ghost stories change over time? But it is also interesting for the reason that that particular version of the story is very similar to the origins of another ghost who's said to haunt Aston Hall. And she's known as the Grey Lady. Of course, she's the Grey Lady. The old house would not be complete without one. But she's been seen wandering around the upper floors of the house wearing either a grey or white dress. And she looks completely solid, lifelike. People have apparently mistaken her for a costumed staff member, only they realise that once she dematerialises into thin air, that living humans can't do that. Others have claimed to see her walking outside the hall, down towards Aston Church across the road. But her backstory is she was either a daughter or a granddaughter of Sir Thomas Holte, and she'd fallen in love with someone inappropriate for a lady of her position. Connected to the servant boy, mayhaps? Anyways, the story goes that she had planned to elope with her beloved, but Sir Thomas had caught wind of their plans and locked her up in a room until she changed her mind. Spoiler alert, she did not change her mind, and so she was confined to this room out of the way for 16 years before she went mad and eventually died. The name Mary is mentioned, although in older books she's called May. Whichever name, we don't know that Sir Thomas actually had a daughter called Mary or May. There were a couple of children of his that we don't know the names for, but the ones that we do are not either Mary or May. Some people, however, claim that this woman was not yearning for her lover, but instead she was someone who suffered from mental illness, which back in those days would have been seen as the family embarrassment, and so they kept her locked away from view until she died. But yet another theory as to who she was came from the Notes and Queries publication in 1872, where a judge called John Simmons Udall, who had a keen interest in folklore and such, wrote that he had been told that this Grey Lady was actually the wife of a baronet, not a daughter or anything, and that she'd apparently been having an affair with a servant, and that's why she was locked up. Again, a story from back in the 19th century, an early ghost story. Connection to the serving boy? The Honourable Judge also went on to write that rattling chains had been heard in the area where the Grey Lady had supposedly been locked up, although no one else had even mentioned that in the sources that I could find. But isn't that just such an old school ghostly phenomena, isn't it? Takes you right back to the time of Jacob Marley rattling his chains. So whichever backstory this Grey Lady has, we don't know for sure who she is or what really happened to her. But she's not the only ghostly woman. We've got a more colourful one too, the Green Lady. Witnesses have described her as being about 50 years old, and she's wearing a green dress with a high lace collar on it. Sometimes she's seen walking around, but mostly she seems to appear sitting in a chair in the Great Hall. She seems to be able to choose who she appears to, or she can only be seen by more sensitive people, and she usually tends to make her presence known more often when there's deep cleaning or major renovation work going on at the hall. And based on her story, that makes sense. She's keeping an eye on the place, making sure no one is doing anything untoward with the major work going on. Because she's said to be a woman called Mistress Walker, who was apparently a housekeeper for Sir Thomas Holte, although she doesn't appear to have suffered the same as her colleagues did. There's no talk of violent deaths or mistreatment with her at all. To be fair, that is all we know about her. There is nothing else I could find. But she seems to be the apparition that you're most likely to come into contact with. In the mid-80s, as a museum staff member was locking up for the day, he noticed a woman in a green dress sitting in one of the chairs in the Great Hall. And the Great Hall is the first room that you go into as you enter Aston Hall. So that's where the reception desk is, and at this particular time, the receptionist was in there closing up. And so he just called out to the receptionist like, you do know there's a guest like right there, right? Does she need help? Is she waiting for someone? The receptionist had no idea what he was on about. She was alone in the Great Hall. She could not see the Green Lady. Thinking that was most definitely weird, the staff member was talking to a supervisor who had retired about this weird encounter. The supervisor said, oh yeah, that's the Green Lady, and he'd had his own run-in with her because he'd been called out to the hall in the middle of the night over 20 years ago because the burglar alarm had been triggered. He'd gone to the hall, obviously check over that it was all okay and help the police out, and as he entered the building, he saw the Green Lady walking down the stairs. She has also been seen in the nursery by a staff member who was on duty upstairs in the 90s. And he was upstairs alone. It had been a quiet afternoon, and so it came almost time to close up. His supervisor got on the radio to tell him, there's no one else coming, you may as well start locking up now. And so he did as he was told. He started going around the rooms and locking up. As he was doing that, he just started to get the gut feeling like there was someone else up there with him. Nothing nefarious, just like when you know that there is someone in the vicinity kind of thing. He started walking along the corridor towards the nursery when he saw an older woman wearing a green dress. And your first thought is that it must have been a visitor. They must have been up here the whole time, or they somehow, not likely, slipped past you. Only thing was, she was kind of transparent, which museum visitors don't tend to be. So, yeah. When he radioed his supervisor, he very nonchalantly replied back to him saying, "Yeah, that's the green lady. I saw her a couple of years ago. Just a resident ghost. Don't go looking for her, because you won't find her now that you know what you're looking at." And another staff member was once doing a tour, taking a group of visitors around each room, talking about the history. Mid-sentence though, this tour guide caught in the corner of his eye that there was a woman, again, sitting down in one of the chairs. He was about to launch into a very firm telling off, "You can't be sitting in this fragile furniture, please get up," when the woman disappeared right in front of his eyes. He just stood there, absolutely stunned, speechless, with the group of visitors getting a little bit concerned. "My guy, are you okay? All the colour is drained from your face and you look like you're about to throw up." The group hadn't seen the green lady, only the tour guide had. But she has also appeared to children too. There was a school trip on and they were in the Great Hall. The teacher was standing at the front talking to all the kids, and she noticed some boys at the back just kept turning around to look behind them. She just called out to them like, "Is everything okay? What are you looking at?" To which the boys replied that there was a woman wearing green sitting in one of the chairs. The teacher just assumed that the boys were messing about though. There was no one there. Only the boys were adamant that she was wrong and that she just couldn't see her. But that is not all supposedly going on at Aston Hall. There may be some echoes from the English Civil War, which, I mean, it was a pretty significant time in the entire country, but more so here, being attacked in 1643. Apparently, in August of 2000, there was a museum assistant who was in the kitchen wing of the house, just hanging about again if visitors need to ask any questions as they come through and whatnot, when she noticed what looked to be a glowing ball of light that flew into the room from an exterior wall, bounced against the wall before ricocheting and exploding with an almighty bang on the opposite wall of the kitchen. What now? When she gathered herself and decided, yep, I've definitely not just had a stroke or a migraine to end all migraines, she went and got help. They listened to the story and examined the walls to make sure that there wasn't any damage, anything like that, to which there was nothing. But the account led some people to believe that this was a ghostly cannonball that would have been fired at the hall during the siege of 1643. Voices have also been heard specifically around the grand staircase, where the damage from a cannonball can still be seen. So the story goes that maybe these voices are soldiers arguing, but we really don't know. We don't know what they're saying. Elsewhere in the hall though, children have been seen and heard in the area of the nursery, even when there are no living children visiting, no school trips, nothing like that. The rocking horse has also been seen rocking away on its own. No drafts, no one walking past on uneven floorboards causing it to do that. And then there was something really interesting I came across. In October 2023, a journalist called Kirsty Bosley visited Aston Hall to write a piece promoting the ghost tours that they were hosting at the time. And I know, promoting a ghost tour, immediate eyebrow raise to anything I have to say next. But apparently, while they were waiting outside, ready for the tour to start, she looked up and saw the shadowy figure of a man wearing a wide-brimmed hat looking down at them. She nudged her mate, who also saw this, and then got his camera out to take a photo, where, yes, you can see a shadowy-looking man in a hat peering out of one of these windows. What makes this interesting, at least to me, is that Kirsty went on to say that this figure moved closer to the window, as if trying to get a better look at them, but they never saw any more detail in his face. And if true, by her saying that he moved about, it means that it couldn't have been like a hat stand or just a really creepy shadow, anything like that, right? She says there wasn't any other staff members wearing a hat or anything once they got inside. Obviously, can't rule out a caretaker or whatever, but still, I wanted to tell you about it and show you the photo. There is also a story from the stable block, and apparently the presence of a young girl has been picked up in the end cubicle of the toilets in there. It's thought that she was the victim of a murder, but other than that, we have nothing else. No details, no further backstory, no even real sightings. But regardless, some people do feel uneasy being in there, especially alone. And I feel like that's the thing with these stories today. There has been a lot of allegedlys, which, hello, you're talking to me, that's all I say. But also, we don't have clear details on backstories. We don't have records. We just have a lot of passed down information, some from centuries ago. So it does make you wonder how much of this is true. It has been said in one or two sources I found that James Watt Jr., the guy who rented the hall in the 19th century, he encouraged the ghost stories to try and keep people away. Haha, try that nowadays, you'll be overrun with YouTubers. But aside from that, ghosts have long been associated with Aston Hall anyway. There was even a fictional ghost story called The Ghost of Aston Hall, or The Mysteries of the King's Chamber, which was published in a one-penny novelette in 1860, where it told the story about a guy who goes missing from the hall and it's a ghost that spills the tea on what went on. But while the details of what truly went on at Aston Hall may have been lost to time, it hasn't been completely erased. There are seemingly some ghostly residents still walking the halls, perhaps forever keeping the secrets of what life was truly like under Sir Thomas's rule. Those passed down stories of murder, imprisonment and despair surrounding the hall and its former owner, though, have to leave you wondering just how much truth lies beneath the rumours. Because while this one was an extremely interesting one to look into, it does leave you with a lot of questions, doesn't it? I don't believe that the ghost of the cook is there. He died at Davidson Hall, if he even died at all. Sir Thomas haunting Aston Hall, even though I didn't come across any stories of sightings of him, I could absolutely believe it. With the rest of the ghosts, though, I would just love to see more backstory, more concrete proof as to why they're there. And that's not doubting that someone is there. It is an old house, it has seen hundreds of years of history. I'd just love to know more about who these entities were in real life, which I guess is the age-old forever question when it comes to the paranormal, isn't it? Either way, it was still a great week of research, well spent. I really enjoyed looking into this one, even when we have ghost stories that evolve over time. I mean, I just find that fascinating from a human psychology and the passing down of folklore side of things more than anything, but it is still a little bit frustrating trying to go through all of the different details and going down each rabbit hole. History though, just gotta embrace it. And I've never actually visited Aston Hall. I obviously absolutely will next time we get a chance, now that I've fully looked into it. But I've always had sort of like a little tenuous connection with the place. I used to work in Birmingham, so I would pass by the place every day on the Aston Expressway, and seeing the church spire, which was actually the parish church where my grandparents got married. And so then add in the ghosts, I'm all the way there. But as always, I want to know your thoughts, your opinions. What do you think about Aston Hall? Have you experienced something here yourself? Please tell me all about it. And if you enjoyed this video, please do give it one of them little likes. And if you've enjoyed hanging out, maybe you'd like to subscribe if you haven't already, so we can do this again sometime. And I have one more thing to ask of you this week. I know, I'm being so cheeky, aren't I? I've been nominated for 2 awards at the Ghost Planet Network Awards this year, and honestly, I can't quite believe it. There are some brilliant names that I've been nominated alongside, which is absolutely amazing to see, but it would mean the world to me if you would head to the Google form in the pinned comment and vote for me in the categories Top Podcast and Most Original Content. And thank you to everyone who nominated me in the first place. That was a bit of a shock. But anyway, that is all from me today, I promise. So go get yourself a drink of water, make sure you are keeping hydrated. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. I don't think I made a mistake in that one. That was very good of me. Or I'll get into editing and realise that most of it is a mistake, and then the whole thing can be a blooper. How about that?